Hello friends, English literature, Elizabethan and Jacobean drama, The Duchess of Malfi by John Webster. Brief questions with answers. Brief questions 164 to 208. Question 164. What does the Duchess do when Bosula gives her some apricots? Answer. When Bosula gives the Duchess some apricots, she eats them very greedily. Question 165. How does the Duchess feel when she finishes the apricots? And so the Duchess just finished the apricots and they are making her stomach feel uneasy. Question 166. How does Bosula become sure that the Duchess is pregnant? Answer. When Bosula gives her some apricots, she eats them very greedily. The Duchess just finished the apricots and they are making her stomach feel uneasy. It makes her feel sick. This shows that the Duchess is pregnant. Question 167. What is apricot? Answer. Apricot is a sort of fruit. Question 168. What false alarm does Antonio raise when the Duchess was about to give birth to a child? Answer. When the Duchess was about to give birth to a child, Antonio raises a false alarm to close all the gates of the court, saying that the Duchess's jewels of 4,000 ducats have been stolen from the cabinet. Question 169. Why does Antonio raise a false alarm? Answer. Antonio raises a false alarm so that none can come to the Duchess's bedchamber during her delivery. Question 170. Who informs Antonio that the Duchess has given birth to a son? Answer. Cariola informs Antonio that the Duchess has given birth to a son. Question 171. My nose bleeds. Whose nose bleeds? Why? Answer. When Bosula comes in darkness near the Duchess's bedroom, breaking the curfew, Antonio accuses him of poisoning the Duchess with the apricots that he gave her. He accuses him of being the one who stole the jewels from her bedchamber, saying Bosula is the one that should be most suspected. Bosula, enraged by this accusation, fights Antonio, making his nose bleeds. Question 172. When did the Duchess give birth to a son? Answer. The Duchess gave birth to a son between the hours 12 and 1 in the night, Anno Dom 1504. Question 173. How does Bosula get the horoscope of the child? Answer. After Bosula and Antonio fight, Antonio flees, dropping the horoscope of the child by mistake, and Bosula gets it. Question 174. How does Bosula come to know that the Duchess has delivered a son? Answer. After Bosula and Antonio fight, Antonio flees, dropping the horoscope of the child by mistake, and Bosula gets it. Thus, he comes to know that the Duchess has delivered a son. Question 175. How does Bosula want to convey the news that the Duchess has delivered a son to her brothers? Answer. Bosula conveys the news that the Duchess has delivered a son to her brothers through Castruccio. Question 176. Who is the mistress of the cardinal? Answer. Julia, wife of Castruccio, is the mistress of the cardinal. Question 177. On what pretext does Julia come to Rome without her husband? Answer. Julia comes to Rome, saying her husband that she is going there to visit an old ascetic for prayers and meditation. Question 178. Why do you weep? Why does Julia weep? Answer. When the cardinal says that no woman is constant in her love, Julia begins to weep. Question 179. You may thank me, lady. Who says this and to whom? Answer. The cardinal says this to his mistress, Julia. Question 180. Why does Julia thank the cardinal? Answer. The cardinal says to Julia that she should thank him for helping her to get rid of her husband. During her stay with her husband, she only receives kisses from him, but no liberty. The cardinal has enabled her to lead a free and unchecked life. Question 181. What does Delio want to give Julia? Answer. Delio wants to give Julia some money. Question 182. Why does Delio want to give Julia some money? Answer. Delio wants to give Julia some money in order to make her his mistress. Question 183. Why does Julia reject Delio's offer? Answer. Julia rejects Delio's offer of gold coins on the grounds that music has greater charm for her than gold. Question 184. Why is Julia not tempted by gold or money? Answer. Julia indulges in sex just for love, not for money, so she is not tempted by money. Question 185. How many children did the Duchess give birth to? Answer. The Duchess gave birth to three children, two sons and one daughter. Question 186. How does Ferdinand react at the news of the Duchess's childbirth? Answer. At the news of the Duchess's childbirth, Ferdinand goes crazy with anger and shouts out his anger in spite of the cardinal's advice to show restraint. Further, he curses the Duchess's brashly curses the Duchess's brashly, describing her as a strumpet. Question 87. Why does Ferdinand long for a dose of rhubarb? Answer. Ferdinand longs for rhubarb to quench his rage that is caused by news of Duchess's childbirth. Question 188. What is rhubarb? Answer. Rhubarb is a cathartic drug that has the capacity to cause emotional cleansing. Question 189. How do the Cardinal Ferdinand react to the news of the Duchess's childbirth? Answer. The two brothers react differently. While the Cardinal gives a politic calm appearance, Ferdinand explodes into a rage at the news of the Duchess's childbirth. Question 190. Who, according to Antonio, say that the Duchess is a strumpet? Answer. According to Antonio, the common people say that the Duchess is a strumpet, meaning a whore or a harlot. Question 191. What would there be an assumption that nothing could happen between the Duchess and Antonio? Answer. There would be an assumption that nothing could happen between the Duchess and Antonio because he is born from a lower class. Question 192. To whom does Ferdinand want to marry his sister, the Duchess? Answer. Ferdinand wants to arrange a marriage for his sister, the Duchess, to the great Count Malatesti. And question 193. On what grounds the Duchess refused to marry Malatesti? Answer. The Duchess refused to marry Malatesti, calling the Count a mere stick of sugar candy which you could see through. Question 194. I do suspect there had been some sorcery used on the Duchess. Who says this? What the speaker mean here? As Bosola says this to Ferdinand about the Duchess of Malfi. He suspects that some sorcery is involved, making the Duchess love an undeserving man who she is afraid to acknowledge. Question 195. Does Ferdinand agree with Bosola's hypothesis? Answer. Ferdinand completely disagrees with Bosola's hypothesis. He thinks that it is her nature that makes her that way, not sorcery. Question 196. How else could Ferdinand force a confession out of Duchess? Answer. Ferdinand will force a confession out of the Duchess using passkey to her bedchamber that Bosola stole. Question 197. What does Cariola say when Antonio asks her if she will ever marry? Answer. When Antonio asks Cariola if she will ever marry, she replies that she will never marry. Question 198. What reason may Cariola have for not wanting to marry in future? Answer. The reason may be her inability to choose wisdom or riches or beauty. Question 199. What type of life does Antonio prefer? Answer. Antonio prefers married life. Question 200. Why does Antonio prefer married life? Answer. Antonio prefers married life because he himself has been enjoying the bliss of marital life. I repeated, the bliss of marital life with the Duchess. Question 21. Who was Daphne? Answer. Daphne was the daughter of the river god Phineus. She was wooed by Apollo. She foolishly fled from her lover, and as a result, she was transformed into a laurel tree which bears no fruit. Question 202. Who was Syrinx? Answer. Syrinx was a nymph who was pursued by Pan, the god of sheep and shepherds. In order to escape him, she jumped into the river Ladon and was changed into a reed. Question 203. Who was Anaxarete? Answer. Anaxarete was a maiden of Cyprus. She rejected her lover Ephes and was turned into a stone statue. Question 24. When does Ferdinand enter the Duchess's room? Answer: Ferdinand enters the Duchess's room quietly while Duchess speaks to herself into the mirror in the mirror. Question 25. How does Ferdinand enter the Duchess's room? Answer: Ferdinand enters the Duchess's room using a false key procured to him by Bosola. Question 26. How does Ferdinand overhear his sister? Answer: Ferdinand overhears his sister entering her room quietly while she speaks to herself in the mirror. Question 207. What does Ferdinand overhear his sister? Answer: Ferdinand overhears that his sister is talking about her lover husband. She says that one day her brothers will find him out. She also says that her husband should sleep in his own bed as her brothers are there in the palace. She again says that she will not allow him to produce any more children until her brothers will accept him as her lawfully wedded husband. Question 28. Why can't Ferdinand definitely the Duchess's husband overhearing her talking? Answer: Ferdinand cannot identify the Duchess's husband because in her talking she does not mention the name of her husband. Thank you friends for watching my video.